First, thank you. You all did so many things. You served this mission in these moments in so many remarkable ways that is hard to distill. But I want to express a deep appreciation for your witness in the world and your witness among us today. Thank you. One of the first places I had the opportunity to kind of represent CDF in seat in this role was at an Aspen Opportunity Youth Forum there in, I think, May of 22, or was it 20? May of 22. And Karen was there, and one of the first voices, I'll stay there. And what happened there, and I just want to get beyond the resume a little bit. There are ways in which we speak of gentlemen appropriately, at least I do, as the mother of the child advocacy movement in America. But in that space, it was very clear that Karen Pittman was the mother of the positive youth development movement. And I just needed to say that to put some respect on her name. So folks who are not in that space appreciate it, because there's also a bit of a full circle moment for us. At that convening, we began discussions with the American Youth Policy Forum about adding and integrating their work into CDF, which last year we completed the paper, but we're still on the journey. For us to be able to live fully into that expression, you gave us something in that regard. At the tip of the spear in that conversation about education, though, I want to ask about something that we're going to do immediately with what you said. On Monday, I, Dr. Christopher Clemens, our National Director of the CDF Freedom Schools Program, and Lauren Relfer, who's our Director of Public Policy, will go to UVA and be a part of this Education Rights Institute conversation about access to quality education in America. Very much still an access conversation. But part of what we want to get a sense of, part of what Dr. Clemens and I were talking about yesterday, is that we're kind of itching for an education policy campaign at CDF, one that can bring together these varying pieces. And I think you put some cookies on the shelf for us. What would you have a sense that, any additional pieces, but what might be some of the powers that need to be and some of the things that are possible in this moment for a national education rights campaign that might put maybe a little bit of more meat on the bones of what you just shared, but just noting that it's really timely for what we're trying to do in this regard?
I would say I could talk about this a long time. I would say a couple things quickly. One, having spent the past 5 years with K-12 educators, I think it's really important to lean into adolescence and to force them to separate elementary from secondary school and talk about an agenda for 12 to 25-year-olds, which immediately pushes outside of their comfort zone. And it says, well, what do we do with those other kids? And we say, well, we have got answers. And as you're working with the American Youth Policy Forum, it's a perfect opportunity for you to expand that agenda. An agenda to say we're looking to have quality education pathways for adolescents. In this official definition of adolescence is 12 to 25, I think opens the door to year-round, experience-based, opportunity-based, competency-based learning experiences in the community and in schools. The reason I think this is so important is the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, 2 years ago, they're the people that made up the seat time, the Carnegie unit. That's how schools are locked in to strict classes, academic standards. You sit in your seat this many hours, you get a grade, et cetera. They came to the table to say, we made it, we can help take it apart. This is a moment in time in which we're working with the organizations like XQ Institute that are really developing competency frameworks that you can hand to young people. They can map their own competency journeys, where they want to go. They can talk about the learning experiences they need to have to build more competencies. And these tools can be used in any setting where learning is happening. And that's what we need. We need to break it out of the schools. We need to have responsibility for the school system to pay for this stuff and to have standards for it. But the standards now are put into phrases that young people and empower the places where they're spending time. So that's the suggestion I would make, but I would make it around adolescence. Because if you keep it K-12, it's going to keep drifting down to elementary school kids. I think that's not important, but that's not where the energy is. And that's not where our advocacy needs really are.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Olivia, one of the things we talked about yesterday was about leadership context at this moment. You framed the moment remarkably for us and kind of the stakes on policy pass with this election. We talked a lot about that as a team yesterday. I wanted you to, but at dinner, we talked about the challenge of leadership in the sector, child advocacy organizations. I shared my testimony and confessional about the challenge of seeing leaders who started after me, who have left organizations, even in this short span that I've been here. Could you say a little bit about what the landscape of the movement is like and what, you're on your second round of leadership here at CLASP. What does this movement need in leadership of these institutions that are now like 50-year-old legacy institutions? What do we need to be a leaderful movement to advance and look into the future?
Well, that's a big question and a wonderful one to think about. I guess I'm curious, in this room, how many people would say that in the work you're doing, in your community, whether it's community, state, national, that you're in a leadership role, that that's a part of what you do? Okay, quite a few people. I would urge reflecting on what you love about that, what's hard about it, what stresses you out, and what made you choose it. Because I guess a couple overall observations. One is that one of the things I've learned about leading in advocacy worlds is that people don't come into advocacy because they like authority, right? People come in because they want to change things. And moving into leadership roles requires coming to terms with the fact that people aren't going to like you all the time. They're going to push back, right? I hear a lot of, they're going to push back. And they have a lot of really useful things to say when they push back that you ought to be listening to. But you may not be able to do all of them. You may have a broader perspective. You may have a sense of breadth across. And so I guess I think that one of the challenges of leadership in this setting is that people who come into the setting need to value leadership enough to want to do it and then come to terms themselves with all of the conflicting pressures. And I think, so again, I'm looking at this as an older white woman. I hear a lot of women in leadership talk about some of those stresses, about what it's like when people don't like you, how to think about that. I also think that having a highly conflict-filled outside world, right? Huge attacks, huge hatred. On the one hand, it can make people hold closer, but it can also make your organization fracture in just the same ways as outside, right? I'm hearing other people recognize that. So that's another piece of it. And then I guess I would also say, and you and I were talking about this last night too, that sustaining the money, the staff, the energy, the physical setting, I mean, there's all of that is part of the work. And again, some of us, there are a few people who've always liked that, who know they like it. And then there are those of us who like it because it helps us do the work and maybe discover a skill at it or a taste for it. I was talking to somebody about fundraising the other day, and she said, that seems very scary. And I said, when you believe in the work, it's about telling the story powerfully, and you come to be able to do it. So I think those are also issues. And then I guess the last thing I would say about legacy organizations, about a generation really from me to 10 or 15 years older, like to Marion's age, there is a generation that's moving on in a lot of the Washington, D.C. based organizations, and it's often a generation, it's more white and more male than the leaders after it. And the organizations are much more diverse than they used to be, which is an important asset. They're much more likely for staff to be unionized, which they are now at CLASP, as there's much more energy around labor organizing. And I see all of those changes as positives. They're all about representing more voices. But you then have to have the skills of valuing and integrating that conflict. And you need, and I will say, I didn't say this at the beginning, I'm really grateful that my husband, Dr. William Fry, came today. And I say that both because his research, which you should all ask him about, has been incredibly important and useful in the work, but also because everybody who tries to do highly stressful leadership work needs at least a few people in your life that take your side no matter what. Right? You have plenty of people in your life who will say, oh, I actually have some advice for you. You might have done that better. You might have done it differently. You need a few people that are just saying, boy, that was really tough, and you obviously did the right thing. So those are all some reflections.
That's great. That's great. I got a chance to cheat by starting, but what other questions do you have for these remarkable leaders? I'll move around and play Donahue for a second. If you laughed at that, you aged yourself, just for the record. Yeah, I'm just saying, you did it.
Hello, I'm Casey Ortiz. I'm from the National Office. I'm the Director of Advancement Services. And I have a question for the two of you, each of you. And with, of course, we can learn all of the things that you all could teach us, but using the model of mentoring, what would you give without giving policy or practice? What would you give any one of us as a step to move forward in our work, regardless of where we work and how we can move this forward in each of our jobs? So an example I might use is someone used, Marion Ellman said, find your place and go, find where you're best in. What would you make a recommendation of for each one of us?
Well, that's a great question. I guess in keeping with what I just said, I would say lean into something that you think is important but really difficult. Find your way into something that's hard for you, leading, supervising, being direct in conflict, listening, whatever it is that's hard for you, lean into it and look for the mentors and the ways to overcome that.
I guess I would build on that, and I would say, take the time to know what your journey is to the truth. Do you go through data? Is it your head? Is it your heart? Is it your hands? What gets you there? And then trust that journey, and don't take shortcuts. Before you're really ready to land to do something, really make sure you've taken your journey there.
It's me. Couple of things. One, several years ago in the CDF Southern Regional Office, we did an analysis of a comparison of A school districts in Mississippi to D and F school districts to really just try to paint the picture of the difference in the children and the backgrounds of those children as they enter school and how that undergirds what happens with accountability standards coming out. And we came upon something that was really surprising to your point, Karen. Even in the highest ranked school district in Mississippi, they only ranked at 59% for college and career readiness.
Right.
That was the A school district.
That's right.
So we started thinking about, okay, what is it that children need and what is it that we're missing, and especially in this fast-paced, global kind of economic environment we are moving into. Having said that, the conversation about education and what we do about education systems, we clearly have failing systems for where the world is now, not only for minority children, but for all children, actually. The system that we have is not working. But how do we enter this conversation without falling into the trap of supporting all of the stuff we don't want to see happen, like the charter movement or doing away with the State Department of Education or, education is failing. How do we You know, how do we walk through that conversation at the same time knowing that our children need more?
There's a book called The Future of Learning, written by Ulka Yossi Hansen. It's not a small book, but it's a great book, written a couple years ago. And in it, she talks through an incredible effort, like the history of education thinking and how we got to where we are in terms of our school systems, et cetera. But she says, if we're going to rethink this, you don't start with the system at all. You start by saying, what's the purpose of education? What is the purpose of education? And at every point you say, what's the purpose and who's doing it? So that if the system isn't doing it, we can be armed with the answer of who is doing it. Her first circle is what's the purpose? Then what do we know about teaching and learning? What's the science tell us about how young people learn and grow and develop? How do you turn that into curriculum instruction to support it? And then after that, how do you build up the human capital that's going to support that? And then you get to the system. So I'd love to spend, I'm happy to, during tailgate time, to talk to you more, but there are so many things now that are out there that allow us to really map and tap into the people, places, and possibilities where learning happens, and then ask what system is supporting them, or what system are they're doing that in spite of them, in spite of the system. But we have to come out of, we can get to reforming systems by starting with the purpose and then staying true to what we know about how learning happens and then finding out where it is. We need to move from a mindset of deficits and scarcity to one of assets and abundance. And we can do that by looking and asking young people, not what's not happening in your school, but where is something happening for you that you'd like to have more of?
I guess I'm definitely not expert on education, but I think what resonated for me in a number of areas about your question is this question of being realistic about the world we're in, which has a lot of coded attacks, right? The attacks you're describing on education are often attacks on black children, or they're attacks on unionized public school teachers, or they're attacks on the very idea of government spending, right? And so you're trying to figure out how to walk a line. And I definitely don't know the answer to that. I do think that for CDF, with your breadth across many fields and your geographic breadth, you have the ability to choose fights based on location and based on topic in a way that sequences them and decides what's right in what moment. But I wanted to surface something I heard at lunch, which seemed to me to be a piece of a solution, which was your story about, that was in the Knoxville area, about an attack on freedom schools from a banned books perspective, which parents in the community fought back on because they wanted that richness in education, and you won. And so I actually think that thinking about where you have the opportunity to tell the story about the better way, not just based on the research, as you've done so powerfully, but based on the people and what they want, maybe that offers more opportunities. But I'm sure you've been thinking about that, and I'm sure it doesn't work everywhere at all moments. It's just one of the techniques that, because of what you do, you maybe have at your disposal.
Great, thank you. Add a quick follow-up aside. Karen, could you mention again the author of the book, The Future of Learning?
It's Ulka, U-L-C-C-A, Yossi, J-O-S-H-I, Hansen, H-A-N-S-E-N.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Janice Jackson, and I'm one of these people who's done all the jobs that you've talked about. I've been a middle school teacher, I've done research, I've done policy, I was a Fed in the Clinton administration, and then I led school districts. And one of the comments that I would make about leadership is the most important thing, know yourself. Because when they come for you, they come hard. And so you've got to know who you are at your core and where you will draw a line and say, I'm not doing that. This is what we're doing. So that, for me, is step one. And step two is, how do you build the table? I think it's on the back of a shirt over here about policy. There's no policy without us. What's the group you need to bring together? Essential in that are the people who are affected. But what are the many different aspects that need to be at the table, asking each other questions and growing together? And finally, I will say district people are not your enemy, right? So we need to start at what's the best for our children. You know, that has to be the core of the conversation. Thank you.
Ashe, thank you. And more proof that the smartest person in the room is the room. I have a question over here from Lauren, then Dr. Stanford.
Hi, good morning. Lauren Relaford, and I'm the Director of Public Policy here at Children's Defense Fund. I don't know why I said Children's Defense Fund like we're all not here because we're here. But I think this question is more about lessons learned. I think one thing that is very evident if you go into these meetings with staffers and members of Congress is that when you say, for example, child tax credit, you know, if we make sure that it's fully refundable and all the good things, we're going to help children, especially Black and brown children. And then you get the long faces like, ew, why would I do that? And so was wondering just some of your lessons learned when you go in and speak about those that are historically marginalized and intentionally underinvested in. What line do you draw, and how do you create a coalition of folks that, I don't want to say shame, because as a social worker, we're never supposed to shame folks, but really make those folks, create a accountability mechanism for those folks who are doing these things intentionally, because of course they want to perpetuate the status quo. And just so wondering, from your research perspective and your policy perspective, just sort of how you go around those folks or go through those folks.
So that obviously is a question that has hundreds of years of history behind it, right? And a lot of those pieces are in that room. It's a great question. How do you achieve economic justice successes like the fully refundable child tax credit, and how do you talk about race and exclusion when you're advocating, right, Lauren? That was kind of the core of the question. Right. Yeah. And I want to say a few things about lessons learned. The first thing I want to say is a lesson overturned. For much of the white economic justice anti-poverty community, for a long time, people thought the lesson was don't talk about it. Tell them how many poor white people there are on SNAP and don't talk about race. I think we learned, I learned probably a decade or two ago, everybody learned, that the problem with that is that people have it in their heads. The fact that you don't say words doesn't make people who have myths about race in their head not think them. It just means they're not putting them out there for you to answer. So I actually think that while there could be an individual conversation in which you make a choice of how to pitch an idea, and there are certainly plenty of conversations where you want to emphasize how many different communities benefit, right? Which is different from completely suppressing it. I don't think that not telling the story is a very productive strategy. So I think it's about how you tell it, who to, in what context you organize outside, right? In what context you organize inside. The Democratic members of Congress are a really different group than they were 20 years ago, right? That's why it was possible to get that refundable tax credit. The person who stopped it from being permanent was Joe Manchin, who is from West Virginia, which is a very poor state, but a very white state. The accountability has already spread a lot and given us much more to work with than we used to have. So I think building the accountability in the organizing side and building the storytelling, the narrative that, on the advocacy side go hand in hand. And I guess the other thing I would say is that I'm not a purist about which reason you use. If many things are true, I'm perfectly happy with using the reason that works. And so I'm going to use childcare as the example. People can debate forever about whether child development, the economic returns to investment, the racial and economic justice argument that the women of color who work in childcare should get a fair wage, the parent organizing, which of those things works? I'm an all of the above person, right? They're all true, they all matter, and you pick what works. So I guess, I know that's not a very short answer, but I would say the lesson learned is no single thing always works. You need a lot of different approaches, inside and outside, and not talking about race doesn't make it go away, right? Everybody in this room knows that. There can still be strategic choices, but they're not strategic choices with the idea that not mentioning it will somehow solve your problem. So that's a start anyway. We can talk more at the tailgate.
Good afternoon. John Stanford, State Director for the Ohio office.
Oh, great.
I consider myself to be a student of education, school funding, and education reform policies, and wanted to, I guess, get your perspective on this idea of, since our system, going back to Olita's comments and the educators' comments about how fractured our system is when you look at it across the country, what are your thoughts about there being a constitutional amendment movement on education that dealt with school funding and also reform efforts?
I don't have a lot of thoughts on that, to be perfectly honest. It's an intriguing idea. My first reaction is it could backfire, but that's truly a reaction. So let me give time to think about it. I'm here all day.
First of all, I want to say thank you so much for your presence here. It's an honor to be in your presence, and I just really feel grateful for just to learn so much from this rich history from you guys. So thank you so much for being here. My name is Jose Perez. I'm the program strategist at the New York office, and we run a really great program, great pilot that we just sunsetted, and now we're moving to the policy space. She just read what says on my back, no policy about us without us, which means that, you know, if there's gonna be a policy about young people, then young people should have a voice in that policy, right? So when we talk about leadership, one of the things that we center, one of the anchors that we have is centering youth voices, right? Centering the lived experience of youth voices, because how could we know what a child needs if we're not having a conversation with them, right? If we're not asking the question. A lot of adults, for me, even me in my experience in the foster care system, people assume what we need, you know, right? And to me, that's a colonial kind of response to how we, right, conduct business. And we don't want to do that. We want to stray away from that, right? So my question is, like, how are we centering youth voices and making sure that we have the training and have the support, creating these intergenerational coalitions so that we all can kind of like see our young people, see them as leaders and be led by them?
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for saying that you felt as though you could learn something from us, because I think that means a lot in terms of intergenerational coalitions. I think people who are older can be scared. They don't have anything to say that would be useful, so that's powerful. It's interesting to me. So at CLASP, our youth policy team, which is actually now spun off to do a transformational youth development institute, whose acronym I'm now forgetting, but I know they would want to be in touch with you. The people on that team, when they built their youth voice group work around something called the New Deal for Youth, cohort of 50 young people from around the country, they challenged me. They said, you have got to have young people on the board. Not teenagers necessarily, but young people. And it was very interesting because, you know, our board was full of people who had achieved distinction over the course of long careers. And so getting them to think about distinction early in someone's life, it was just a different way of assessing who could contribute. But we did, of course, the two quote young members are now both probably, one's just over 30 and one's just under 30, so they're not as young as they were. We need to be continually moving on that. But one of the things I would say is that once you start engaging young people's voices, it is such a rich and powerful and valuable experience that people who do that want to keep doing it. And so I would say just jump in and figure out a way to do it, and then that reinforces how important and powerful it is going forward.
I agree with everything Olivia just said. And I want to add, I think in my experience, and again, there's some exciting tools that can help us do this, the best way to really make space for youth voices is to make space for all voices. And by that I mean, if you if you just say, I'm bringing 5 young people into this room, you can bring them in, but everybody's going to have, just like with race, you're going to have a bias around what people of different ages and backgrounds are going to have. And you're not going to get that equal space. To actually take the time, I'm going to share another resource with you. It's called Community Share. Community Share is one word, .org. There's a guy in Tulsa who has come up with this idea of a human library. How do we treat our community like a human library? And every book on the shelf, you can read that full book. And what he's done is to create a profile page with your picture, with your passions, your professional experience, your lived experience, your interests, your skills, how you want to approach a room. It's like a 2-page outline. You can fill it in as much or as little as you want. But he's getting people to fill that out so that if you're asked to volunteer, you're volunteering, you have a chance to volunteer your whole self, and it's a way for everybody in the room to be known. If everybody in the room does that, whether you're 16 or 65, and fills it out fully, you've got an opportunity for people to read their full selves before they come into the room. And that, for me, is the best way to get youth voice integrated in with all voices.
Great, thank you. This will be our last question, and then Sherry Brady's going to join me to officially present the awards.
Thank you, Doc. Hi, ladies. I am Shaquita Pegues. I'm the Managing Director for the CDF Freedom School Program. We recognize that the work that we all do is a part of our passion, right? It's hard work, but we also recognize that it is heart work. And so I'm always thoughtful about how we exercise radical self-care and what are those things that have sustained you along the way, and what do you do now on your journey to find a balance with the work and maintaining your health care?
Well, the first thing I did was to stop being a boss. Yes, and that was important. And people say you retire. I didn't retire. I rewired, I refired, I did something else. I just said, as Olivia said, take the thing you're not passionate about. I was not passionate about running an organization of 60 people through the pandemic. That was not going to give me joy. So I said, I'm old enough to retire. They'd already asked me to stay an extra 5 years. I'm going to stop and say, no, I'm not taking that on. The second thing that I've learned to do is to, again, as I said, follow my path to the truth. My path to the truth as a person who thinks is to just open up my computer and let it go wherever it wants to go. To take the time and the space to really be curious about whatever I'm reading and thinking about, and then do something with it. At the end of the day, I have to do something with it, but I start and give myself the luxury of that journey. I don't do many things, and I'll tell you that's what I do.
So I think my answer is probably a little more boring in terms of, I do like running big, messy organizations. Although I also, during the pandemic, and I thought I retired, well, not retired. I thought I moved on to a more flexible consulting life from the one I was running, but 2 years later, I'm back trying for an interim basis. And so I've always gotten my breaks. I mean, I love the outdoors. I was a runner. Now I'm a fast walker, but I love being outdoors. I was a very slow runner. There's actually less difference than you'd think between the slowest runner and the fastest walker. I love to read. I read fiction. I read absurd mystery fiction, and I read serious fiction, and it all just something that takes me away from what's going on. And then, I mean, I think those are the biggest things. Those and family are the biggest breaks. And I do, when I take vacations, it used to be easier before 24-hour internet access, but I remember once when I was assistant secretary, I took a vacation hiking I think in the Rockies, and they said, how do we reach you if we need you? And I said, well, I guess the ranger could ride a horse to the place we're staying, but this is on you. You guys are in charge. I have total confidence in you. It's not going to be me. So all those things for me.
Please help us again. That's Olivia Golden and Karen Pittman. We do want to formally thank and appreciate and present these awards, but there are just gaps. I was even thinking about, we did our timeline activity. There are these gaps in our sense of history and memory, and part of the gift you have given us is of joy of filling in a gap in that timeline. There are things that we consider in different periods. And also, so many of us who work in different spaces in the work came in our eras through either volunteering with Freedom Schools or through activities here on the farm or through state offices, that this element of the beginnings of CDF, I talk about it, folks have heard me talk about it as CDF 1.0, pre-Black Community Crusade, public interest law firm, policy research interest, which we never went away from, but it was a core identity, is a piece that we're not as connected with in the same way. And so it's a remarkable gift to what we talked about with the team as our sacred and celebrative memory. The need for both sacred and celebrative memory in this work, because we're not just at an organization. We really do serve now an institution that is a core element in the movement, and if we lose these elements, then the movement may lose these elements. And so we have a great responsibility that you have supported us in this moment. And so we're glad to celebrate you with that appreciation in mind. The other thing I'll say is this is different than the other Advocate for Joy presentations in that we've not had the opportunity with others to journey with them and have them reflect as deeply as you have with us. So the way we have been able to do it here has been of special joy and benefit to us. So thank you both for these gifts. So for the formal award, I'll begin with Olivia and put some fingerprints on your award, sorry. Children's Defense Fund is proud to present the Advocate for Joy Award to Olivia Golden in recognition of advancing child well-being so all young people grow up with dignity, hope, and joy, 2024. Reading similarly, but formally doing so into the record. The policy team tells me I read stuff into the record. Children's Defense Fund is proud to present the Advocate for Joy Award to Karen Pittman in recognition of advancing child well-being so all young people grow up with dignity, hope, and joy, 2024.